So if I were to ask you, even before this class had started, before you had any thoughts of theologically, before you read any of the coursework, if I was to ask for you to list some attributes of God, 8 out of 10 of you would have at least one or two of these on this first list, on your list. And here, so we're talking about God's attributes in terms of the perfections of God. And here we're really talking primarily about the three classic omnis that we say. It's omnipresent or omnipresence, omniscience or omniscient or omniscience, and then omnipotent or omnipotence. We're going to unpack each of those here. So, omnipresence, what are we saying? What are we actually affirming when we say that God is omnipresent? So, omni means all, and then presence. So, all present. We are affirming by omnipresence that God is everywhere, that there's not a place a person can go that is outside the presence of God. Now, I believe that. I affirm that. I think that's true, but it doesn't come without some difficulties that haven't always been exactly thought through. And as people who've given some thought now to these things, you need to be aware of it and maybe even give it some thought. For example, one of the ways that hell is often conceived theologically is to be away from the presence of God or outside the presence of God. That there's God, He's the source of life. Hell is the place of death. And by definition, hell is to be kind of away from or apart from, separated from God. The question then is, if God is omnipresent, is God in hell? Is God present to those in hell? Now, that shouldn't kind of cause you to doubt hell or doubt God in any kind of way. It's a mystery. It's one of these things that we don't have all of the things wrapped up with a nice, neat bow on the top. There are difficulties. And so I affirm omnipresence. I don't think that God is in hell, but I don't know how to bring those two things together perfectly. That's one of a few issues that we'll raise here before we're done. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but pantheism is a worldview that essentially equates the created universe with God. And if you push omnipresence too far, you end up with pantheism. So not only can I encounter God out in the woods, but the woods themselves are God. That's the difference between the traditional omnipresence and pantheism. But if God is everywhere, then God is in the tree. God is in the ground. God is in the, and doesn't take too much to get there. You can see these passages of scripture there. I'm not going to read them or have you read them, but there's some examples of omnipresence we see in scripture. Okay, the second of the omnis that we're looking at here is omniscience. There is no order necessarily for them. It's just the order I'm talking about them. So again, omni is all, and then think science or knowledge. So when we claim that God is omniscient, we're saying that God is all-knowing. Now, most Christians will agree. In fact, I don't know of any Christian that doesn't agree that God is not all-knowing. But the question is, how do we understand that all-knowingness, and how does God know what He knows? There are a variety of opinions out there. We will look at 4 together, and I really kind of loathe the fact that we aren't together face to face right now, because this is one of the areas we're talking about God's attributes. This is one of the areas that gets fuzzy, and I often see eyes glaze over. So if you have questions, I'd encourage you to join Monday night on office hours, or email me questions if you have them, because I want you to be clear on this. So the first one we will call determinism, and it can be found in Augustine and also in John Calvin. It's kind of a similar theological stream for the most part. So really we could think of Calvinism in general. How does God know the future? These folks would say God knows the future. God knows everything, including the future, because he determines it to happen. So how does God know what I'm going to say? Because he's written the lines of the play of my life. Every action, every event in the universe is obeying the perfect will of God. It has all been determined by his sovereign decree, and as such, there's no difficulty at all in God knowing anything, particularly knowing the future. It's not a hard thing at all because God has determined it. Of course, he's going to know. So that's one view. Um, yeah, I was going to say something else about how that fits into human freedom. We'll unpack those here after I talk about all four. So the second is going to be what I'm calling simple foreknowledge, and that would be the Arminian side. So that's the traditional debate between Calvinists on the one side and Arminians on the others. Um, God's sovereign and in control, determined for Calvinists, God, and humans have free will for Arminians. In the Arminian side, they would say that God merely knows in advance. He doesn't cause the events. So the best example here is I take my kids to an ice cream store, and it doesn't even have to be one that we've ever been to before. But I know that the odds are great that my son, who's my middle child, he is going to, well, let me start with the first one. So my oldest is probably the most dangerous to my example. She is willing to try anything. It's probably going to be something fruity for her, but if she got something in her mind that she was going to try sardine flavored ice cream, uh, who knows? She might try it. So she's the kind of the lone wolf on this example. But my son, my middle child, 80% chance he's going to get a peanut butter milkshake. My daughter, the youngest, there's an 80 to 90% chance that whatever has the most amount of chocolate is what she's going to go for. Now, did I determine any of those choices for them? Absolutely not. But I know what they're going to do. Why? Because I have a certain degree, a certain amount of intimate knowledge of them. And the idea here would be that if it's an imperfect, finite people, if we could have that kind of ability to perfectly anticipate what someone else is going to do, what someone else is going to choose, if you could ratchet that up exponentially to God's perfect knowledge of us, well, then it's not at all difficult to think that God could know everything, particularly the future events of free people, without having determined them. So the question of whether actions are determined or not is the issue here. So Calvinism, determinism, it happens this way because God has ordained it this way. Arminians, he knows it, but he has not actually determined it. Now here's what gets a little, we're kind of moving from the shallow end of the pool and now heading out into the deeper end. This next one is called middle knowledge. It gets a little convoluted, but it's really interesting. And I have a decent example that I'll have you watch that will probably make it kind of golden for you once I'm done talking about it. So there are some folks, one of the great Christian minds around today is a guy by the name of William Lane Craig. He's a debater, he's a philosopher. He's a little bit pompous, but he's just a brilliant mind, though. So William Lane Craig would be a person that is in middle knowledge. So he would say that human beings are absolutely free. And this is why I probably should have said about the freedom. So Calvinists are going to say essentially that humans don't have free will. Okay, we'll talk about freedom later when we get to anthropology, but humans don't have free will. Arminians are going to say absolutely they have free will. This middle knowledge is going to say yes, humans are free, like Arminians, but God is still sovereign, like the Calvinists. So they try to find this middle ground, actually. How do they do that? So they would say you have choices that you're absolutely not compelled to make in any way. God isn't coercing you. There's not any external pressure. You're free to make them. But he has set up the world in such a way that, well, let me pause. The idea here is, or part of the idea here is, that there are an infinite number of possible worlds. So every day, think about how many different choices you make, and each of those choices determine other choices. So really, every day, there's an infinite number of, or a seemingly infinite number of potential choices. Now you factor that over everyone's life, and you can see that there's essentially an infinite number of possible worlds that could come into being because of these different choices. It would seem then that it would be impossible for God to know, to know those things in advance. Well, middle knowledge folks say God does know. He knows what's called counterfactuals, what would happen if. And the idea here is that he chooses which of those millions and millions and millions of possible universes. He's going to choose which one he's going to allow to come into being in reality, because that particular one of all of the other ones is going to be the one that brings him the most glory. So here you have, 5 million trillion whatever different variations of the world, but the one that you and I are living right now is the one that he has allowed to bring into being, because it's the one where all of our choices brought together bring him the most glory. So he's still completely sovereign. How? Because he's choosing which of the many, 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 many different universes that could exist, he's choosing which one actually will exist. So he's sovereign over that. But every choice that those people make along the way are free choices. So the other part of it is we do understand that as we move, as I said already, each choice you make limits other choices. You've chosen to go to a particular college. That limits your choices. You've chosen to have a major, that limits your choices. So those, as we move, the free choices that we have, not every choice is potentially available to you. You start, as we move, other choices get ruled out, other choices get ruled in. So God is sovereign over all of those things. So he's not compelling us like you could argue in Calvinism that he is, but he's still completely sovereign in a way that he might not be in Arminianism, simple foreknowledge, because he is sovereign over which world came to be. Now, what might help this is a clip that I'm going to put up from YouTube from the movie Men in Black 3. There's a character by the name of Griffin who can see small glimpses of the future, but he sees all of these futures. So this really gives you a sense of sort of what it would be like for God. Now he's a victim of all these different. He never knows which one's coming down the path. That would be a way in which this isn't like middle knowledge. God knows which of the ones, but this sense of all these different possible universes that could come into being, that is exemplified by this character Griffin. Where it changes is for middle knowledge, they would say, but God actually knows which exact world is going to come into existence, which universe is going to come into existence. So I'm going to stop now so that the next thing that you watch is actually that clip, and then we'll come back and talk about the fourth view of omniscience together.